week, in fact, I received one of the several magazines I subscribe to because I'm a member of the APA. Monitor in Psychology is one of the American Psychological Association magazines, and I was reading through it. In fact, the picture that I got on the email was of an article, if I can find it here quickly. The article has this picture, and it's a continuing education article, and it's on forgiveness. And the first paragraph, if I can just read a little bit of it to you, Everett Worthington, PhD, has been studying forgiveness for nearly a decade when he was faced with the worst possible opportunity to put it to test. And it goes into that, and I won't say it because I think he will talk about it. So it was kind of, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe that maybe in God putting things together for our benefit. And so as we were looking at his presentation, I got the magazine that said, hey, very appropriate. And I'm glad that he came at that time. And so we met last night for the first time. We went out to eat and had a delightful time. And I got to know him very personable. I always, when I don't know someone personally, I don't know what they are like in person. And some people tend to be a little above me. And other people are very normal, very nice, and I appreciate you being just like that. And I'll show you just the kind of person that he is. This is his book, Forgiving and Reconciling, and I said I always like to have the author's autograph if I can. And so I gave it to him. I said, would you please write to Claudio, the man who inspired me to write this book and gave me so this is what he wrote instead. To Claudio and Pamela. I didn't ask for Pamela, but to Claudio and Pamela, who inspired all of these ideas. The Lord bless your ministry. So, I think we're in for a good time because we have someone who is not only very knowledgeable, has done the research, has experienced it, but is also one of us. And so we're glad to have Dr. Worthington with us. Let's bow our heads and have prayer before we begin. Father God, we thank you for bringing us together for these meetings, and especially today for these presentations by your son and servant, Everett Worthington. We ask you to bless him and use him as he speaks to us. Keep our minds open and attentive to what he will say. And may we take this information and put it into practice in our lives, because all of us need to forgive. At some point or another, someone or another, sometimes harder than others, but we all need it. If for no other reason, to obey you, to follow you, but more than just that, to enjoy the type of life you designed for us. So use him and bless him as he blesses us, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's give him a welcome.
I'm going to just trust that you can hear me. If you can't, stand up and walk out, and then I'll know. So I went on a 12-mile hike yesterday, which was 2 laps between the parking lot and my place that I'm staying. I did survive that, though. So I am really happy to be with you today and to be able to talk with you about forgiveness. And most of the forgiveness I'm going to talk about is interpersonal forgiveness. So this is in contrast to God's, gracious forgiveness of us and merciful forgiveness of us. But we get a lot of talk about that. Not so much talk about, well, how do you forgive other people? Once God has forgiven us and we want to pass that along, how do we do that? And so I'm going to give you a understanding that's built up, in research over probably 30 years, in my clinical practice over 35 to 40 years, about forgiveness. And what it is, how to do it, and hopefully this will give you different slant on things than you may have right now. One of the things the Bible's great about is inspiring us to forgive and telling us that this is good for us. But science is kind of, God's world speaking a general revelation about the world that God has designed. And so science can tell us things that the Bible doesn't tell us. Science focuses on how do you do this? It can't tell us we should do this. The Bible tells us what we should do, but the details of how do we forgive other people, those are the things that science can maybe enrich our understanding of forgiveness. So, so I should tell you what Commonwealth Professor is. I do study humility, but it's about other people. But a Commonwealth Professor is actually a designation that the Board of Visitors gives for folks that I guess they're about ready to put out to pasture. So anyway, there's a couple of Commonwealth Professors at VCU, and I was fortunate to get one of those. So things that I'm going to do over this 2.5 hours that we have together, this session and the next session, is I'm going to try to give you an understanding of what forgiveness is and the way that we understand forgiveness. And I will end up telling you that there are actually 2 types of forgiveness that are different from each other. And although they may be related to each other, they don't have to be related to each other. They are 2 different things. We can experience each one. Another thing that I will do is to talk about a model that I have developed and that we have tested and other people have tested around the world in something like 25 or more studies. Randomized clinical trials in which people are randomized to condition. And this works as one of the 2 most effective models that exist. And then I will talk a little bit about self-forgiveness also and what self-forgiveness is. So this is my mission should I decide to accept it. I used to teach Psych 101 for 35 to 40 years. And so I am used to people praying in the midst of my lectures. I look out at these 300 eager, inquiring minds and notice that many of them are praying. Their heads are bowed. But they also spontaneously do things like get up and move around or ask questions. So I am used to interruptions. If you have a question and you wish to ask it, cut loose. Don't be inhibited. So what I'm going to start doing in this half of the lecture is I'm going to give you a case study about forgiveness and health. And then I'm going to talk about a model that I've developed on a stress and coping model of forgiveness. And then, later in the second half, I will talk about how do we put this model into effect. So let me give you this case study, and this is about physicians. So I spoke at the Sydney Seventh-day Adventist this summer. Yeah, it's similar to this, only it's smaller. But and so I talked to that, and what everybody was interested in was health. And so when I prepared this, I focused a little more on health than I might usually do that. So let me talk about one of the greatest, probably perhaps the greatest contribution to medical science that the United States has ever made. And this is the invention or discovery of anesthesia. It used to, back in the early 1800s, anesthesia did not exist. It was a horrible medical, anytime you got hurt, basically the solution is cut it off. And there was nothing to numb the pain. The best that they could do is give people a bottle of alcohol until they passed out, and then they just chopped it off or sawed it off. It was terrible. And they always separated the people out. There was a surgery was an entirely different building usually with just sawdust on the floor because of all the blood, and people screamed so badly that, it disturbed the other patients. So they moved them to a different building. Well, so in the 1840s, there was this dentist. His name was Horace Wells, and Horace Wells went to a party. Like many parties today, I'm sure we never go to any of these parties, but some people go to these parties where they kind of get high, and the way that they got high back then was to breathe laughing gas, nitrous oxide. So these were NO2 parties, and they would bring people up, like they would try to get the most distinguished person in the audience, and they would have them come up and they would have them sniff this laughing gas, and and then they would do silly things and bark like dogs and crawl on their hands and knees, and everybody had a big time at their expense. So they get Horace Wells one night to come up, and he humiliates himself in front of everyone. On the way back, he whacks his shin on a chair or something, and it bloodied his shin. But he's so high on the laughing gas that he doesn't even notice. He's like, yeah, cool, I hit my shin, And then later, as he started to sober up from this, he starts to realize, wow, I didn't feel that pain. I think this is a great idea. So he turns to his buddy who's with him, and he says, I wonder if you'd help me out after this meeting is over, after this party is over. And so he took his buddy to his surgery, and this guy must be a true friend because he talked the guy into sniffing this nitrous oxide and then allowing Horace Wells to pull one of his teeth. I don't have any friends that I'm that friendly with, but, so he pulls the tooth, and, the friend is like, I didn't feel anything. This is great. So Horace Wells decides, I have got to tell people about this great anesthesia that I have discovered. And so he sets up a meeting at Mass General Hospital, the most prestigious at that time, the most prestigious hospital in the United States. And he says, I am going to do a surgery of pulling a guy's tooth, and, come and watch this guy. We're going to use an anesthesia. And so the doctors and the residents come, and they sit, if you've ever been to Mass General Hospital, in this amphitheater that kind of goes up so everybody can look down and see what's happening. And Horace Wells puts this guy under and pulls his tooth. He actually did a jaw procedure that took about 5 minutes. In the midst of this procedure, though, the patient goes, "Ah!" Well, this did not seem like it was a surgical procedure without pain. Now, although the person afterwards said, I didn't feel anything, it was kind of a reflex in which he, responded with that moan that was a very loud moan. And so what happened was all of the residents and the doctors, when the procedure was over, they started chanting, humbug, humbug, humbug. And they kind of ran Horace Wells out of town, to the tune of, this is a humbug and you are a humbug. A former student of Horace Wells was named William Morton. And William Morton started to investigate this anesthesia, and he came upon a different chemical to produce the anesthesia. So instead of nitrous oxide, he used ether. Now, he got this idea from a chemist at Harvard named Charles Jackson. So he works and he does all the experiment and develops a protocol. And about 2 years later, almost 2 years later, he talks the people, the physicians, into viewing him going to do a procedure. And so he is anesthesiologist. He puts this person under. They do over an hour procedure with this person under with ether. And the person feels no pain. The person doesn't make any kind of reflexes. And at the end of that, he looks up at the audience and says, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." So he feels like he has developed anesthesia. So it turns out that Charles Jackson, who gave him this idea, says, "Au contraire, I gave you the idea. I am the inventor of anesthesia." And so they start fighting with each other. And it is vicious. They sue each other. They sue everybody who mentions the word anesthesia and doesn't mention their name in it. It's just an ugly situation. And so there's this huge conflict. So what we see here is people had their ego involved and reputation is on the line. And they perceive that the other person is inflicting an injustice on them. And they respond out of that wounded ego by developing hate and bitterness and unforgiveness and resentment. Now, remember Horace Wells, the first guy who hit his knee. So he's like, "Hey, wait a minute, I invented this thing. You know, they just changed the chemical, but I did this, and I've been using nitrous oxide for these entire 2 years that William Morton hadn't done, has been investigating this experimentally. I deserve credit." We got another wounded ego involved, and so he does all kinds of things, like he decides that it would be a good idea to go to the French Academy of Medicine. Really? Why did this occur to you? But he goes in 1847 and says, "I want you to declare that I am the inventor of anesthesia." And they go, "We respectfully decline to make a judgment on this." Well, he is so upset with this that he commits suicide. So now, you've got this wounded ego and this sense of injustice, and it leads to a health consequence where he kills himself. And so we see now this same chain, but there's a physical health consequence and mental health consequence. So who really has priority over this? Well, in 1848, it says 1948, no, believe everything you read, But in 1848, the Congress offered a big cash prize for the person who could make the best case for who invented anesthesia, because they could see this was going to totally revolutionize medicine. And so it turns out that William Morton and Charles Jackson both submit for this. The prize was actually never awarded, so they could not decide. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in Georgia, there is this new guy on the scene. His name is Crawford Long. And Crawford Long is just a family practice guy. And he has, it turns out, been using ether to anesthetize patients since 1842, 4 years before even Horace Wells came forth. He's actually really the person who's documented this for 4 years in his case notes, but he's so busy with private practice that his friends harass him and try to get him to apply for this big award that Congress has offered, and he goes, "I can't be bothered by this. I've got many important things to do." So, this humble guy from Georgia is off delivering babies and doing family practice medicine, and yet he's invented this. Let's look at the consequences. This is 20 years later. William Morton is reading a copy of the Atlantic Monthly, and he comes across an article that says, Charles Jackson, the guy he was in these legal fights with for all this time, Charles Jackson is the inventor of anesthesia. And so he gets so upset with this that he has a stroke upon reading this, and just keels over and dies. There's another physical consequence that has to do with cardiovascular response. 5 years later, Charles Jackson is walking through the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, and he comes across the grave of William Morton, and it says, dedicated to William Morton, who discovered anesthesia and gave the world this great gift. He goes psychotic. He has to be admitted to a mental hospital at that point, and while he's in the mental hospital, he commits suicide. The irony is so thick because anesthesia, which is supposed to take away the pain of millions, ends up, resulting in all of the, people who are vying over priority, all of their deaths because of just stress responses. Meanwhile, there's Crawford Long down in, Georgia. 32 years after his first documented use of anesthesia, he's still delivering babies. In fact, he, is delivering a baby, and he starts to feel the signs of a heart attack coming on, but he continues through this and delivers the baby successfully, hands the baby to the nurse, and falls down with a massive cardio event. Dies happy, satisfied, at peace with himself, never got that ego involved. He was a humble guy. This is a quote by William Temple, a former Archbishop of Canterbury. Humility does not mean thinking less of yourself than of other people, nor does it mean having a low opinion of your gifts. It means freedom from thinking about yourself at all. Amen. Doesn't mean you're not going to think of ourselves. It means we don't have to when our ego gets challenged. Well, let's look at what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And so I'm going to start this by a concept called the injustice gap. You may think this probably is the most useful thing that I say today. The injustice gap is the difference between the way that I see the way I would like to see an injustice resolved and the way that I see it right now. Does this make sense? A big injustice gap is very hard to deal with. A small injustice gap, somebody bumps you in the street, 2 steps beyond, you're like, no problem, you don't think about it again. So the size of the injustice gap is related to the difficulty in dealing with this. Now we keep an ongoing, an ongoing tally. We get our mental computers running as soon as we get hurt. We get this ongoing tally of how much injustice we have, and then we keep adjusting the size depending on what happens. So if a person, offends you, and, like I can think of a time when I was offended, if you can tolerate a small story here. I testified in front of the courts on behalf of a young man who had committed a crime, and you did a character testimony. The problem is, I love coffee. And I showed up at court at 8, and they kept me waiting until 2:45, right? And so I didn't get any coffee in all that time. And so I'm a little cranky about this, see? And so I testify, I go in, and they say, so what's this guy like? And I say, he's a good guy. And they say, you can go. Okay, so now I'm ready to go. Okay, it's August. It's 100 degrees in Richmond. I have got to teach at 3:30 in front of a giant Psych 101 300-person section. And I take off flying down to VCU. I park at my usual spot about a mile away, and I take off. I'm in my suit, right? It's 100 degrees. I'm in my one and only suit. And I am running with my backpack, which is right there and weighs about 50 pounds. And so I'm running down the street, and I am sweating like a pig. And suddenly it dawns on me, I haven't had any coffee since 8 o'clock this morning. And to show you the depth of my pathology, I deviate out of the way, go over 2 blocks to Starbucks, get a venti coffee. Where is my venti coffee? Yes, I wouldn't go any place without my venti coffee. And I, am now running down the street, and it's later, it's almost time to teach, and I'm running down the streets drinking hot coffee as fast as I can, mopping myself, from sweating. I run into my office, I grab my flash drive, I run about a half mile across campus, and I get up on the stage at exactly 3:30. And then I proceeded to give the best lecture in the history of Western civilization. I could tell it was because people were actually paying attention. They weren't like on their computer pointing to things, which I'm sure is scientific articles that they're usually pointing to. Yeah, right. And so, but they're just hanging on my every word, and they're nudging each other, and they're, making sure that everybody pays attention. And I go through an hour and 15 minutes, and I am on my A game. I am just, striding back and forth, and I'm making points, and it's just wonderful, and at the end of the time, perfectly timed into this lecture, I stop, and suddenly people jump to their feet and start to rush the stage. I'm starting to have fantasies. I'm thinking they're going to pick me up on their shoulders, carry me out to the VCU campus, erect a statue to my, in my honor. And the first woman who gets up to me goes, "Professor, are you aware that you have something stuck to your forehead?" And I reached up, and it was a piece of napkin about that big around that had been stuck to my forehead for the entire impressive first lecture in Psych 101, and it floats down, And of course, then everybody leaves, right? Now, you'd think that would be the end of it, but students come to lecture armed today with cell phones. And about 2 or 3 days later, a video shows up on YouTube of the amazing professor with the napkin on his forehead. One of my colleagues thought that it would be just a grand idea to send the link to this video around to the entire faculty. All right, so I've got this injustice gap against this guy, right? Okay, now I'm thinking I probably ought to go talk to him. I should confront him about that. I should say, it hurt my feelings when you publicly sent this thing around. Now, here's my injustice gap. What if he had said, "Life is full of little disappointments, isn't it?" What's my injustice gap now? Yeah, it's much bigger, right? So now it's harder to deal with. But what if he had said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize," he falls down, he starts crying and throws up. I'm looking at this. What's happening to my injustice gap? Yeah, this is good. He's suffering. Justice is happening here, right? And, he looks up at me. He sees I still got this look on my face, and he goes, "Can I do anything to make up for this? Could I give you $1 million?" I'm like, "Well, take a little of the edge off." "Could I clean your toilets for the rest of my adult life?" Okie dokie, I'm there, I've got this small gap I can deal with. So this injustice gap, if a person apologizes, it, shrinks. If a person seeks to make amends, it shrinks. So those help us forgive, right? And if a person doesn't want to take responsibility, it grows. Now, we can forgive anything regardless of how big this injustice gap is, but it's harder to deal with if we've got a big injustice gap. So it really helps us if we apologize, if somebody apologizes to us or seeks to make restitution. We have a lot of options for dealing with injustices. "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father, you deserve to die." Okay, one of those is revenge. This is not really good. You know, revenge is great for eliminating my injustice gap. The problem is it creates a bigger injustice gap for the other person, right? Because I feel my pain more than you feel my pain. So if you hurt me, what you think is 1 unit of hurt, it feels like 3 to me, right? So I say, I've got to get even. I've got to get revenge. I'm going to give him or her 3. I give 3. It doesn't feel like 3 to you. It feels like 5. You are now, wait a minute. I hurt him 1. He gave me back 5. I'm 4 in the hole. I've got to get even. What happens is revenge, every time somebody enacts revenge, their injustice gap goes to 0, but the other person's is still big, and therefore revenge is going to end up in a social downward spiral. But we have a lot of other options that are biblically consistent for dealing with injustices. For example, we could see justice done. We could see a person get the natural consequences. I was riding my bicycle along and this guy runs me off the road, you know, and, you know, when I get back on the road, I make this stupid gesture, you know, of like, what? He slams on his brake, he waits on me on my bicycle to ride up next to him, and then he tends to put his hand out the window and lower his fingers one by one until only one was pointing to heaven. I think he was witnessing to me actually at the time. At any rate, having made his point, he punctuated it by scattering dust all over me and accelerating up the hill. When I get to the top of the hill, having deep thoughts about existential, questions like the fragility of life and how it hangs by a single thread or a single stupid gesture. And when I get to the top, he's parked over at the side of the road. And I'm thinking, and then I noticed that there is one of Henrico County's finest officers that's writing him a love note. And so I saw justice was being done. He got what he deserved. And so just to show him that there was no hard feelings, as I went past him, I gave him the Queen's wave. I am a friendly guy. I did go up into the neighborhood and ride around and get lost, so he couldn't find me again after that, though. All right, so we can see justice done. That will reduce the injustice gap. We can also turn it over to God. None of these is forgiveness. Notice. These are ways of dealing with injustice. Some people turn it over to God because they are appealing to God for divine justice. This is God at his computer with his finger over the smite button. They're saying, God bless that person for doing this to me. But other people, turn it over to God and say, God, this is your problem. This is not my problem. It's a relinquishment to God. We can forbear. This is popular in collectivistic cultures. Forbearance is just not responding for the sake of group harmony. We could accept that just stuff happens. I'm moving on with my life. Life is too short to deal with this stuff. Or we could forgive. Now, forgiveness is a good option when we have gotten to the place where we are unforgiving, where we are bitter and resentful and angry and hostile and full of hate. That's our best option, especially as Christians. But we can deal with all of these ways of handling injustice before or if it never gets to a place where I develop unforgiveness. These are perfectly scripturally consistent. So what is forgiveness? Turns out forgiveness is not one thing. Forgiveness is 2 things. So one of the things that forgiveness is it is a decision. It is a decision. And it's a decision about how you intend to act toward this person in the future. I'm not going to get revenge. I'm going to treat this person as a valued and valuable person. Or if I can't, because say this person is dead or moved away to California, I would treat them as a valued and valuable person. This doesn't mean I have to, hang out with them, be their best buddies. It just means I'm going to treat them as valuable. This is not a behavior. Do you see that? It is an intention. I may never get to carry out this behavior. Suppose that I forgive someone with a decision to forgive, and, the next day as I walk into the office, they pie me in the face. I may never get to carry out the action from before because now I have another problem to deal with. See? So what's important in a decision to forgive is that you make this behavioral intention statement. This, I believe, is the type of forgiveness that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6, 14 and 15, where he says, "For if you do not forgive those who sin against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. But if you do forgive those who've sinned against you, your Father in heaven will forgive you." It's a decision. We cannot control our emotions, but we can make a decision. Okay? So I could make a decision to forgive and be biblically in line with what is required of us as a Christian, but still have unforgiving emotions toward this person. Because I've suffered this huge wrong, or many, many wrongs, one after another, and I can't make my emotions just go away like that, but I can make that decision. So even though we may decide to forgive, we may still have emotional unforgiveness. So emotional unforgiveness is a complex combination of emotions. Resentment, bitterness, hostility, hatred, anger, and fear. And we have those kind of jumbled up and we feel yucky toward the person, even though we have made a decision that we're going to act differently toward them in the future. Now, that suggests there must be a second type of forgiveness, and that second type of forgiveness we call emotional forgiveness. Emotional forgiveness is the emotional replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions, resentment, bitterness, all those, with positive, other-oriented emotions. Empathy for the person, understanding the person, sympathy for the person, compassion toward the person, love toward the person. Now, what is complete emotional forgiveness? Well, it turns out it depends on what kind of relationship you've been harmed in. So if you have been harmed by a stranger or someone that you do not intend to ever interact with again, such as, this happens often with spouses who they get divorced and one of them moves away, and it's like they don't want to have any contact with them. I'm never going to interact with them again. Complete emotional forgiveness is basically getting to neutrality, right? I don't want to feel negative toward them. I don't have to feel positive. But if this is a person I'm going to be in regular interaction with, and this is a valued person like my child or my partner, then I'm not really, content with getting to where I feel nothing toward them. Does that make sense? That if I told my wife, I've forgiven you, I feel absolutely nothing toward you. Well, I predict I'll probably spend the night on the couch there, okay? So, no, I want to get back to more positive state, okay? So I don't quit replacing the negative emotions with positive until I get back positive with someone who is a valuable person to me. So these are the emotions that you can use to replace. empathy, sympathy, compassion, altruistic love, agape love, or romantic love, actually. And other non-self-focused emotions can actually help. So humility can help. Gratitude for having been forgiven by that person, by God, by someone else. Gratitude can help. Hope that this is going to keep our relationship going, or this is going to turn out better. That can help. Now let me make a distinction between forgiveness, emotional forgiveness, decisional forgiveness, and reconciliation. Reconciliation is restoring trust in a relationship where trust has been damaged. So, if I'm going to restore trust, this requires that both people be trustworthy. Does that make sense? I cannot restore trust if the other person says, I'm going to kill you if I see you again. We're not going to reconcile. Now, I believe the Scripture teaches us that God requires decisional forgiveness. God desires us to get to emotional forgiveness, but doesn't require it because He understands the humanity involved in being hurt repeatedly or very deeply. God does not require reconciliation. Paul says, as much as it is up to you, live at peace with all people. It isn't always up to us. If the other person refuses to reconcile, then we're not going to reconcile. God wouldn't require that, because if that were required that we reconcile, that other person could hold me hostage, right? By saying, God requires you to reconcile. Well, I'm not going to let that happen. God is going to get you for not reconciling. No. God doesn't require reconciliation. We are ambassadors of reconciliation, are we not? Reconciling people to God. That's our ambassadorship right there. Not reconciling people to each other. All right. Now, we do want, God wants relationships to be reconciled to the extent possible, but it's not always up to us. Also, notice, saying I forgive you is not forgiving. So we see this woman here saying, of course I forgive you. And she's got the dagger to stab him in the back. Saying I forgive you is part of reconciliation. You see, that helps us to restore trust. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness happens inside my skin. Reconciliation happens between two people or two groups of people. Let me tell you just a little bit about forgiveness and health. This is based on a model. You will be tested on this at the end of the day. Okay, so no, you won't. But this is a model that I've actually been describing, in which a transgression happens. You have this injustice gap that you perceive, and then you try to cope with that by making a decision to forgive and perhaps experiencing some emotional forgiveness. So what happens with this stress and coping model is we feel stress when we experience this transgression, and we feel stress when we experience a large injustice gap. And we try to deal with that. We try to deal with that by reducing the injustice gap. We try to deal with that also by forgiving. So the basis of the effect on health is that unforgiveness is stressful. It activates what is called the HPA axis. There are several physiological axes. So the HPA axis is hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then adrenal gland. And so what happens when we experience stress is we get this cascade of neurohormones that stimulate each of these structures in sequence, and the adrenals produce adrenaline. They also produce a stress hormone, a neurohormone called cortisol. So cortisol is a great neurohormone for getting your body geared up to do, things like respond to the stress. Just like adrenaline is a great hormone to do that. But if you keep your body geared up, then those high levels of cortisol will affect every system in your body. It will shrink your brain. It will reduce your sex, your ability to have your sexual and reproductive systems function well. It will affect your digestion. It will give you irritable bowel syndrome. It will affect your cardiovascular system. That's one of the main things that it affects. It affects every system. A biologist named Robert Sapolsky, Stanford professor, who studied this for his career, has written this wonderful book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. It's because they respond to a stressor and then their body goes back to normal. We, as humans, are much smarter than zebras. We have figured out a way to keep ourselves under stress all the time by just thinking about it over and over and over again. See, and so every time I, recall this transgression against me, I jack up the cortisol level again. And so we can keep that cortisol level high. So forgiveness is a coping strategy that can reduce the chronic stress. There are many different biomarkers associated with unforgiveness, the stress of unforgiveness, such as all of my peripheral systems jack up, so my heart rate goes up, my blood pressure goes up, my skin conductance goes up, my vagal tone is affected. So the vagus nerve is the nerve that goes through like the body like a vagabond and turns off stress responses when they're turned on. And I stop being able to be as responsive to turn off stresses. Cortisol's affected, and other things, alpha amylase, oxytocin. I should probably say just a word about oxytocin. Oxytocin is not a bonding peptide, okay? You may have heard, oh, that's a bonding peptide. No, it isn't. Yes, oxytocin is produced when you bond, but people who are in intense face-to-face conflict with each other also produce oxytocin. It is better interpreted as a relationship attentive peptide. So bad relationships and good relationships produce oxytocin. Now it may be because there's some kind of evolutionary drive to restore relationships because that's, has survival benefits. But nevertheless, it's not just produced when you feel good. And then immune system function. Our immune system can be really damaged by chronic high levels of stress. And as I said here, it's related to self-reports of health and disease in elderly folks, not so much in young folks. Why? Because it takes a long time for the cortisol and other stuff to eat your body up. There's been a lot of research on this. Let me just point out that this book, Forgiveness and Health, is it's an edited book that just came out recently, about a year ago. And it has 20 research teams that review research in each of like 20-something areas. So lots of research on forgiveness and health. The trait of forgiveness is related to reports of physical health, and this is a study that was done back in 2001 by Lauren Toussaint and David Williams. Those are two guys that we co-edited that book together. The elderly reported trait forgiveness and low trait forgiveness related to health problems. Forgiveness is also a state. When we experience these states of unforgiveness, our body gets damaged because of the things that happen, such as our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, the blood is scooting around in our veins faster, and the place that the problems usually happen are at bifurcation points. So here is a vein coming down of some kind, an artery or vein, and it divides and goes to different places. And as that liquid slams into that bifurcation point, the full weight of problem happens. And inflammation at those bifurcation points ends up being a problem. Self-forgivingness, by the way, is another type of, self-condemnation is another type of stressor. Same physical events happen with self-forgiveness, self-condemnation, as with unforgiveness of others. All right. So there are a lot of good reasons to forgive somebody else or ourselves. One of those is better physical health. One of them is better mental health. So why does it create better mental health? Because if I am playing again and again these, events in the Late Late Show of the mind, it keeps re-stressing me, right? So rumination, it turns out, is related to virtually all serious mental health problems. So this negative rumination is related to obsessive compulsive disorders, to depression, to anxiety disorders, to anger disorders, to psychosomatic disorders, related to many, many disorders. So rumination, if we can short-circuit it by forgiving and not having to go over and over the negative, we are going to improve our mental health. Relationships are affected, not so much by emotional forgiveness. The first two, physical health and mental health, are more related to emotional forgiveness. But relationships are more related to decisional forgiveness, making a decision about how you are going to act with this person that you are in an ongoing valued relationship with. And then, of course, there are spiritual benefits to forgiving. That's what Jesus says we should do, and that's what God wants us to do. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left, and so let me stop and see what kind of questions you have for the last 15 minutes. Yes.
Thank you for this information. I really appreciate this. Emotional forgiveness, processing these negative emotions and trying to flush them out by replacing them with positive emotions. And you listed some recommendations there. Is there a time period? How long? Or does it depend on individual or the enormity of?
Right.
I'm just trying to
Yeah, it
understand.
depends on everything, and there's no norms on this. Most people take a fairly long time to process events that they are unforgiving toward. So a former student of mine, a super scientist named Michael McCullough, has brought people into the lab who have just experienced some kind of event. So he doesn't give them any kind of program. He just measures them every day. And what he finds is that unforgiveness decreases in a power curve. So that means faster at the beginning and kind of flattening out. And over about 3 weeks, many of the things that we experience as injustices kind of fades out of our consciousness. The serious ones, though, we keep in our consciousness by, the rumination. And so basically what we're doing is we're starting over every day or every time we do this. So it's much harder to say, well, in 3 weeks this ought to go away, because the person is continuing to reintroduce the starting point on this. So, but, huge events can be forgiven very quickly if the person is in the right frame of mind. So if you are receptive to, say, God's intervention, and, even if it's a big event, you may be just given this grace and this mercy to be able to forgive in a very short period of time. Doesn't always happen that way.
And may I, one more, and then just a follow-up question on that. What I struggle with when I do counseling, depending on the degree of hurt they have experienced, you don't want to promote quick fix by telling them, if you follow these steps, you can experience forgiveness in 3 weeks. I kind of go between those, I struggle with that.
Yeah.
That's why I asked that question.
Okay, so let me tell you some research that I'll tell you next hour.
Okay.
And so we did a meta-analysis of all of the intervention studies that existed in forgiveness. And what we find is that time is the most important variable. Okay? So people are able to forgive about 1/10 of a standard deviation per hour that they try to forgive. This is an average. Some people can try for an hour and get worse because they just crank themselves up and they're trying to forgive. It's actually rehearsing all the negative stuff. Some people just go immediately to forgiveness, do not pass go, do not collect $200, but the average is about 1/10 of a standard deviation per hour of trying. So what that means is if people want to have substantial emotional forgiveness, and we're talking about emotional forgiveness, if they want to have substantial emotional forgiveness, it's probably going to take at least 6 hours on the average. Now they can do that all at once, or they can do that an hour a day during their quiet time, or a half an hour a day for 12 weeks or 12 days. It doesn't matter how it's packaged. It's all about hours. Okay? Yes?
Let's say about sexual abuse or something of that nature, where the person is able to forgive or forget. It's not in their forefront as long as they're not around the predator. But they have to meet, it's a family member, they see them at Thanksgiving once a year or whatever the case may be. And so they get, they're right back at that starting point again. So how does that relate in reference to the forgiveness, the hourly release?
Yeah. So for one thing, dealing with something really serious like sexual abuse or physical abuse or something that is really serious, often, when we start talking with counseling someone, we don't deal with forgiveness at all for a long period. The last thing somebody really severely damaged wants to hear is you should forgive this person. It's like, well, and I should forgive you for saying that, but I'm not. So, Suzanne Friedman studied incest survivors, and she said, we go 26 weeks at an hour and a half a week before we mention the F word. And that's the way they think about it. Forgiveness is the F word. But then, after that, it takes an average of 60 hours to forgive something really serious. Now, the question that you raised, though, is that, okay, they see this person again. Now, if they've really forgiven this person, okay, then they will experience anger when they see them again. Or fear. Anger or fear, both. Now, that's because that's the way God designed our bodies, right? It's like there is an automatic, pain, anger response. Okay? So I cook breakfast for my family. I have for 30-something years, and so I'm cooking and frying eggs, and then there's this cabinet right above the stove, and it can sense when I'm not looking at it. So if I look down, it pops open, and the corner, comes like this, and then I'll lean down and wham, I hit my head. What do? Do I go, praise the Lord? I do not do that, I confess. I go wham, I punish it for doing what it did. And that is a conditioned response. That's the way God made us. And God made us to feel fear when we've been hurt. Because if we didn't, that would be crazy. We would walk right back in it again. Now, what happens is people forgive and they think, oh, I should feel like La La Land with this person, right? And so when I see them, I should have this really positive feeling toward them. No, not really. I will feel anger and fear. But it's not unforgiveness. I have forgiven them. It's my body working the way God made my body to work. So the person has to just learn to say, yes, I expect this. It's going to happen. I'm going to manage my distance. I'm going to stay away from them. They're not a safe person for me. But I will accept this anger and fear as my body working the way it should. And I will not interpret this as unforgiveness. I have forgiven. Yes. Whoops.
So we'll take just one more question, but then we want to give Dr. Worthington a little break. So one question, and then we'll stop.
Is there a huge connection between a person's empathy and their ability to forgive?
There is a very reliable connection between trait empathy and trait forgivingness. So, a person who is empathic kind of by nature will also likely be more forgiving by nature because they can see and understand emotionally the other side of things. And they can see, I have forgiven people. I have been hurt, or I've hurt people. And I never got up in the morning and said, today I think I'm going to ruin a person's life. It just happened, I thought I was helping them. And it went sideways and I end up hurting them. So why should I think that this person sat around plotting how they're going to destroy my life? No, I need to see things from their point of view. So that person with high empathy trait is going to be more likely to forgive. Now, as it's going to turn out, when we look at the intervention to promote forgiveness, that, of course, is one of the things we try to help people develop, is a state of empathy toward the person. A momentary feeling of empathy and a ability to understand the event that hurt them.